Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the fifth in our series of lectures for the Gender Equity Network. And thanks for coming tonight. It's one of the few lovely days that we've had in recent years, so well done for them. And I hope that you're going to find this lecture, as the others, challenging in some ways. I don't want you to just see something that you're going to think, yeah, that's what I always thought. I want you to be really thinking, challenging your views, and after tonight, go away, talk to other people, challenge them on their views. Okay? Now, what we have for tonight is something really interesting, something that doesn't get talked about half enough, and that is the whole political landscape we have that seems to be ignoring problems that face men and boys. Now, this is, as you're going to hear, a pervasive problem. And if your eyes are open just a little bit, just to kind of think about how, for example, your own brothers and sisters, or your own brothers or daughters, sons, well, we don't want to be sexist, but just think about how the men in your life might be affected by the blindness that's, that the government seems to have towards men and boys issues. And that would be something really important. And tonight we have Mark Brooks. Now, Mark has been instrumental in a number of areas for men's and boys issues. One is he's the chair of Mankind Initiative.
Yeah, this is
really important in terms of helping men who are domestic violence victims. Also in organising International Men's Day, which for some politicians is a cause for amusement, but we think it's quite an important issue. And also, Mark has run for Parliament too, so kind of very experienced, or has some experience at least, in the corridors of power. So, ladies and gentlemen, just before we start, questions at the end, please, if you can contain yourselves. Questions when Mark has finished his presentation. So, a warm welcome, please, for Mark Brooks.
Well, thank you for that, John. And I have to say, I stood for Parliament twice and never was elected, which is a real shame, because obviously I'd be taking these issues into the Commons chamber if I had been elected. But there we are. So the theme of today is really men and boys issues. In Westminster and Whitehall, why is there a policy silence on those issues? Not only in terms of recognising those issues, but then having public policy answers to actually address those issues. And I'm going to run through this in a number of ways. Okay, in terms of men and boys issues, broadly speaking, they're barriers that preventing them leading full lives. Okay, that's really how I'm framing this. And also, how we're going to run through this is just to have a snapshot of the political landscape in 2016 on these issues, looking at some of the public policy outcomes, looking at some of the reasons for this, and also what can be done. And just as a kind of caveat to kind of frame this, I am saying that women and girls do have issues too. So this isn't just about talking about men and boys at the cost of women and girls. So that's where we are in terms of the outline of today. Now, this is kind of GCSE politics, but the political landscape is made up, broadly speaking, of three pillars. You've got the government and the state. They're the ones who create policy, actually put the laws into place, and actually then the state implements the laws. Parliament, where the laws come from, but of course the government actually control Parliament, have a role in scrutinising the government and the state in how they deliver those policies. And then you have pressure groups, the media and other organisations, and in fact, I would say, us here today are actually a pressure group in our own right. So I'm going to look at those three pillars of government. The first one is around the executive. Now, every single law in the UK is gender neutral. It has to be gender neutral. But what you find is the way that the laws are enacted when it comes to the public policy in delivering those laws isn't gender neutral. And the approach to actually tackling gendered issues is not gender neutral. So when you hear about all law on domestic abuse is gender neutral, well, of course it is, it applies to men and women. But actually when you come to look at frontline services and actually the policy driving those laws, they're not gender neutral. And I'll come on to look at that later. So what I'm saying is the landscape of gender politics is not gender neutral in practice. And I look at some of the architecture behind this. So for example, we've got a Minister for Women and a number of Justice Ministers. We've had 9 Ministers for Women, and this was set up 19 years ago. And they have an overall responsibility for Government Equalities Office, and also on policy on women, policy on sexual orientation, and transgender equality. There seems to be a group missing there. Under the remit of the Minister for Women, there is a group missing. And as you will guess, that there hasn't been a Minister for Men since '97, when the first Minister for Women actually came, and the first one was Harriet Harman. Now look at the Government Equalities Office. Now that's a government department. That was created in 2007. It employs 50 staff, has a budget of 47 million, which used to be actually 78 million pounds, but we had trouble, economic times, so that's been reduced, but it still is 47 million. The director, which is being advertised at the moment, salary for the director will be around £100,000 a year. In that department, there is also a granted title person called the Head of UK Women's National Machinery. And that person's job is to coordinate government policy on equalities across the whole government. And if I read out, I'm not going to read out everything here, but this is quite important. So Government Office, Equalities Office, from their website, is responsible for equality strategy and legislation across government. We work to take action on the government's commitment to remove barriers to equality and help to build a fairer society. That all seems fine. Of course it does. Then it continues. It then says, leading on issues relating to women, sexual orientation and transgender equality. Seems to be another group missing. And the main work that they've actually undertaken over the last couple of years is around gender pay gap, boardroom positions, political representation, and STEM subjects. Nothing on boys' education or mental health, suicide, or those other issues. The next one, which is a kind of semi-independent part of the state, it's a quango in many respects, is the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. And that was formed again in 2007 out of a number of other commissions that actually were in existence. That has a budget of 17 million and it has 193 staff, and its job is really to tackle discrimination and promote equality. I looked at a number of the reports and research that they've actually looked into. 17 have been what you would call neutral issues that affect men and women on disability and race, for example, but also 3 on subjects exclusively on women. Again, it's around boardroom pay, gender pay gap, and sexual violence. Again, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission has not actually commissioned any research onto issues around suicide, boys' education, hopelessness, and a host of other issues. We also have a number of independent commissions around financial services. We have obviously funding of organisations like Ophelia Swan, Women of the Future Summits, Speakers Summits, Domestic Abuse Summits, that are all gender exclusive. They're not inclusive of men and boys issues. International Women's Day is a big policy push from the government. They announced a couple of weeks ago the new Ending Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, and they they use International Women's Day, if you like, as a particular day to push particular policies. And the last one is the government, in the Cabinet Office, there is a special advisor on women, and that's been there since 2012. So again, the architecture, public policy and government is very much about women and girls, which is okay on one hand, but the architecture is not about men and boys, it's not gender inclusive. It doesn't include men and boys. And that's not only in the narrative, but that's also in the policy that comes out, the research and the campaigning that comes out of those state organisations. Okay, so looking at Parliament now, as I said at the start, Parliament's there to scrutinise government. You've got a Women and Equality Select Committee, that set up just after last general election. And that's had 6 inquiries. I don't know if people know about select committees, but they scrutinise government policy and government performance of government departments. They've had 6 inquiries, 3 on women issues, maternity pay gap, boardroom, and also and the gender pay gap. 1 on with regard to Muslim employment, transgender, and reviews on the performance of the Equalities Human Rights Commission. Again, nothing on there. We've got the Women and Equalities parliamentary questions. Now, parliamentary questions are where members of Parliament can ask government ministers about certain aspects of their portfolio as cabinet ministers. And every 6 weeks there's a Women and Equalities parliamentary questions session. Now, I analysed all of the questions that have been asked since the last general election. 46 were on women's issues, 13 were, I would say, gender neutral, about disability, for example, and race, really important subjects, and also just 4 on men. So 1 on mental health, 1 on education, 1 on teaching, and 1 on prison uniforms. So basically you've got the scrutiny of the executive, actually the Parliament again, is very much gender exclusive. Politicians are not asking government ministers about what they're doing on certain aspects of public policy with regard to the barriers that men and boys face. All parliamentary groups, we've got 2 in Parliament on men's issues, 1 on run by the Men's Health Forum on men's health, and 1 on fatherhood by working with men, and they're both brilliant organisations, and they're brilliant meetings as well. I've been to a couple of them. And there's 7 actually on women's issues. International Women's Day versus International Men's Day. Just the verses is really about a different approach in Parliament. A couple of weeks ago, International Women's Day, there was a massive debate in the actual House of Commons chamber. That's happened for a number of years now. All very welcome, raising really important issues about barriers that affect women and girls. But as many of us know, it was a huge struggle last year for us to get recognition, not only of International Men's Day, but also to have that debate. And people like Martin over there did a grand job in actually getting that actually on the agenda in Parliament. But it still is a real difference in the way it's approached, and I'm hoping that this year that there will be 3 hours in the main House of Commons chamber on International Men's Day. A couple of other things about the makeup of Parliament. All were in shortlist. Labour introduced these in the late 90s. They were initially found to be illegal. Some men actually in the Labour Party took the Labour Party to court, to the Industrial Tribunal, to say the use of a women shortlist was actually illegal because it was preventing them from being employed as a member of Parliament on the basis that they did eventually get elected. So the Labour Party at the time had to stop use of them. So about a year later they then put through a law which actually made all women shortlist legal. And what I've found from research is around 193 women have stood for Parliament for the Labour Party on an all-women shortlist. And some of the other parties, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, have used various other tools to actually get more women into Parliament, which isn't an issue, but it is obviously an issue when you then look at some of those public policy issues that are then actually being discussed in Parliament. And the last one, of course, is Women Equality Party, which has been going for about a year now. And I suppose my own comment on that is how quickly that's been subsumed as part of the political establishment, now even appearing on question time, for example. So that's not even going a year, and it's been very quickly formed part of the political establishment. My last point is really about pressure groups. We have obviously Forces Society. Now there is an argument, and I think it's a growing argument now, about whether there should be an equivalent for men and boys now in the UK. A number of charities, and their narrative, and I'll come on to that later, is very much about women and girls, extremely well funded, especially in terms of funding. And obviously we've seen through the issue around tampon tax recently, a number of women's charities, are getting big donations from the government to support them, which is going well, and no criticism of any of that. But one of those donations, which is around £1 million, is probably more than the whole of the men and boys sector in terms of the charitable sector and the whole deal. So, there is this issue about where the funding is to enable charities to talk about issues that affect men and boys. Trade unions, very much their narrative is about women and girls, not about women and girls and men and boys, even though there's a huge problem with men becoming unemployed in their late 40s onwards and not being able to get back into the workplace. And there's not a narrative or a discussion about actually helping those men get back into the workplace. Trade unions just don't talk about it. They talk about the gender pay gap and lack of women in boardrooms, which is fine at one level, but they then don't talk about these other issues. And they also don't talk about the lack of boys who are educated enough and leaving school for GCSEs to go into the workplace. The narrative is not about that at all. And then obviously the media, which is getting better. There are men's sections now in a number of the mainstream newspapers online, which is a real bonus. Right. Okay. So I've been doing some thinking. I've spent all of the Easter, most of my wife's mornings, working on a lot of this. And what I'm looking at is really what I call the political equation. So you've got this mono-gender narrative, and you could say it's a gender-exclusive narrative. And what it means is that the narrative on gender issues in politics is just about women and girls. It's not about women and girls and men and boys. It's just about women and girls. And what happens is that narrative then feeds into the recognition. So there's a lack of recognition in public policy and in government about men and boys issues. That then translates into policies. So you have policies like ending violence against women and girls, but not one about ending domestic violence and sexual violence against boys. You only have one policy. That then feeds through to funding, because obviously the policies are there, but they need funding to actually be able to be implemented. So you have commissioning charities, the state, councils, housing associations, everyone else implementing those policies. And so if you've got a gender-exclusive policy, when it comes to funding those services on the ground, they're only going to be funded one way. And then you end up with mono-gendered services, gender-exclusive services actually on the ground. Across the UK, those services are just gender-exclusive. And then it just goes round and round, it kind of feeds itself. And what I've got in the middle is something I've used before in my work with the Mankind Initiative around, is this a form of institutional sexism? I mean, you had that very much the term came about in the early Blair years about institutional racism, institutional sexism. But this kind of equation goes round and just reinforces all those institutions that I mentioned before that are very much just looking at women's and girls' issues, but not women and girls and men and boys' issues. And I would say, therefore, that that's institutional sexism. I'll give you some examples of how that plays out, because it's not really about theory. If we look at education, now we all know 60,000 fewer boys go to university every year than girls across the UK. Boys are way behind girls when it comes to GCSEs. Far more boys become NEET. Far more boys don't get into, don't take A levels. And also now we're seeing fewer boys actually entering professions. So if you look at the health profession, the legal profession, the accountancy profession, all of those big professions now at entry level, there's far more young women going into those than young boys. But who talks about that? I mean, does anyone here in the public, any politicians, in government policy, any educationists talking about it? There's a number of trade unions having their annual conferences this Easter. I looked at, I think it was the NUT last week and there's one this week. And I looked through all their speeches. They didn't mention boys' education once. Big grand speeches about what the government is doing wrong and what the government should be doing, but it didn't mention boys' education. When all of these facts are there, I mean, these teachers that are teaching these, seeing it for themselves.